Okay, great. Thank you. It's an honor to be with such a great group, and I appreciate the kind words. I'm going to talk today a little bit about mostly smaller cities, and to give you some quick background about myself, I currently teach at MIT, but I am a city planner by training, and I worked in cities in the U.S. for about 25 years as a planning director. So a lot of what I think about is how can we make these cities better. I will say I don't have direct experience in rebuilding after a conflict such as the one you're experiencing. So I will try to do the next best thing and talk about experiences for working with cities that are struggling generally, and then give some examples that hopefully are helpful to you. Um, so I'll try to go through my material. Let me share my screen, and I know that there may be some language translation challenges, but we'll do our best and we'll get through this together. Let's see. So there we have it. We're going to talk about revitalizing cities and main streets generally. And here's my general overview of what I'm hoping to cover in the next 60 or 70 minutes. I'm going to talk about small cities generally, and because so much of my experience is in the United States, I'm going to talk a little bit about how cities work in the US. I'd love to hear more sometime about how they work in Ukraine, but I can only talk about where I have experience, and I think it's important to understand how cities work in the US for what I'm going to talk about. Going to talk a little bit about how to pay for things, how public finance relates to working in small cities and on main streets. You'll see I use the term Main Street as a shorthand for downtowns. Downtowns in particular are what I'm interested in. Thinking a little bit about small cities as a place where people might choose to move. Hopefully, some people have the choices to make about rebuilding, about where they live, and in rebuilding cities, it's important to think about that. Then, and this may be the most relevant part of what I'm going to talk about, I did a study during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic, of what cities should do to try to recover from COVID, recover their downtowns, and what maybe they've learned to do better. As much as rebuilding is a challenge, it's also an opportunity. So thinking about what can we build up better, not that we would ever ask to have to rebuild, but once we do, are there things we could do differently? And I think that happened in the US. And then I just want to touch a little bit on I visited some small cities in Iceland, and I'm very interested in colder climates and cities. So just a few quick examples from there. Again, not directly applicable, but just a couple of interesting examples. And then I'm happy to hear question and answer. I think maybe what I'll do is pause a couple of times, and see if there are questions so that we can make sure the translation has a chance to happen. So I'll pause a couple of times and see if people have questions, and then try to answer them as best I can. So let's get going. First off, when we say cities or small cities, there's a lot of different kinds of cities. I'm going to focus mostly on the smaller communities, of which there are a lot in the world. We hear a lot about the big cities, and I think there's lots of important things happening in big cities, but let's talk about the smaller cities, maybe between 25,000 and 150,000 people. And they can be suburban, they can be urban, there's all sorts. In general, I think about smaller cities that are maybe part of a larger region. Either they're a suburb or they're just sort of part of a bigger metropolitan area. So you see the yellow dot sort of subsumed in that first image by a larger city. Then you often have cities that are near a larger city, but right on the edge of it, so far enough away that maybe they have some of their own independence in terms of what they do, but they also are very dependent on that larger economy of a bigger city. And then often you have cities that are standing alone. Maybe they were a center for farm commerce, or they used to be a service center when it was harder to get from place to place. and they sort of stand alone a little outside of a larger region. There's obviously more kinds, but it's important to think generally about the fact that each one of these types of cities has a different economy, and rebuilding them will be different. And how do they form? In the United States, you're seeing a lot of growth in these smaller cities because people are choosing to move to places where they want some urban amenities, but they also don't want to deal with the high rents and the general stress often of being in a larger city. So what I call the flight to quality, during COVID, we saw a lot of that, but that's not new. It's been happening for a long time. Things like better internet access, better transportation infrastructure, means that people who can will move places where they want to be. And I want to emphasize that's not everybody. A lot of people don't have that choice. And I don't want to forget people who maybe don't have that choice, but it's important to think about this as an economic engine in cities and how to take advantage of it and not have it overwhelm your community and the people that already live there. We have a lot of smaller, shrinking cities in the United States, cities that used to be industrial centers, and are much smaller than they used to be. And they might have very few jobs. They might be hard to get to. A highway might have been built somewhere else, and so the city isn't as easy to get to as it used to be. Maybe there's just not as many amenities, or there may have been some sort of natural disaster. But we have a lot of these smaller, shrinking cities as well. And I think thinking about how these cities start to recover, particularly as people start seeing the attractions of smaller cities, is an interesting thing to think about. And then you often have these smaller cities that just get entirely absorbed into a bigger metropolis. Either they're annexed, or they simply economically are part of a larger region. So in the Boston area where MIT is, Boston isn't actually a very big city, but it has several cities right near it that are really part of what you probably think of as Boston. And when people come to Boston and learn about city planning, they're surprised to hear these are all separate cities. And that's a whole different type. That's sort of like the dot that's inside the larger metropolis. Why do we care? And these are numbers from the U.S. I'd love to see what numbers equivalent there are in Ukraine. But one thing to note, as planners, we often, at least in the U.S., learn that there's the big cities and then there's the suburbs. And people are moving to the suburbs from the big cities. And the data that I look at suggests that it's more complicated than that. There are a lot of people living in these smaller cities. This is just data from the United States Census that suggests that the 10 largest cities in the US have 26 million people in them. The next sort of level down of cities between 150,000 and a million people have 51 million people living in them. And then another 50 million living in smaller cities that we're talking about. So this doesn't include the smaller suburbs or rural areas. A lot of people are living in these smaller cities, and I think it's important to think about how important they are to a national economy, and also how it can be an opportunity to grow sustainably. You don't have to choose between putting everyone in the capital city or putting everyone out in the countryside. These smaller cities are really important, and I really think they are a key to how we can grow sustainably on this planet. In the US, this trend has continued. I won't dwell on this, but this is not a one-time thing. I've had people ask me if it was a COVID blip. It doesn't seem to be. The population of the US is growing, but the population of these smaller cities is growing faster. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how local government works in the United States. Not to dwell on it for too long, but I think it's important background for the type of things that I might recommend and how you might need to adjust them based on your cities and how things work in your country. So local government in the United States does certain things. Generally, the key functions of local government in the United States are public safety, fire and police. That's often a local government responsibility. Public works, maintaining not the major streets, but all the little streets in a city or town and sidewalks. That's the local government that generally does that. Planning functions, economic development functions are often administered locally. And then depending on the part of the country you're in, sometimes the school system is managed by the city or town as well. That's more common in New England, where I am, near in the Northeast. Other parts of the country do it differently. And similarly with social services, with providing housing for the homeless, providing medical care for people who don't have health insurance, that sometimes is provided locally by local government, sometimes it's not. Another thing to remember is that the United States, we think of it as a big monolith. It's actually technically 50 separate countries in some ways. It's 50 independent states, and that's obvious from the name, I guess, but we don't think about it that much. But it really means that every state does things a little differently. And this was more true in the 19th century, but during the 20th century, a lot of programs became national. And now we're beginning to see a little bit of a trend back towards states acting a little more independently. So states in the United States will often get money from the federal government to run a program, but then every state may run it very differently. And that's challenging in some ways, but it's also an interesting opportunity because it allows for a lot of experimentation. And then even more so when you think about how every city may have a chance to apply these programs locally, you end up with some interesting innovation and experimentation, but you also end up with some chaos. So it has its pluses and its minuses, but just important to remember, unlike some other countries like the United Kingdom, the US has a lot of things that are done much more locally. So what is local government? As I mentioned, it's different in every state, and one of the big differences is what we call home rule. So in the United States, cities, some states allow cities to basically pass any laws they want as long as they don't violate state law, and that's called a home rule. That means that the city can pass a law on something, and if it doesn't contradict state law, it can do that. Um, the other kind of city in other states it's called the Dillon's rule state. There was a judge named Dillon. It's named after, and that means that cities can only do what the state allows them to do. If the state doesn't have a law saying a city can do something, it can't do it. Um, so that's a big difference. A home rule state will allow a city to do a lot more things than a Dillon's rule state. So I'm not familiar with how that works in your country, but it's important to realize that's a big difference when you do local revitalization and want to create new programs for downtowns, respond to external things, respond to recovery needs, things like that. In addition, there's a lot of different types of local governments. We often have the mayor and council form of government, where you have a mayor who's the executive officer and a city council that's the legislature of the community. But there's also other forms as well. Sometimes there's what's called the city manager form of government. And that's a little different because the city manager, who's the chief executive, is actually not elected. She or he is appointed by the council, but there isn't a directly elected mayor. And then in New England, we have this thing called town meeting that I'd love to talk about, but we don't really have time. It's a whole different form of government as well. So cities and towns are very different in different parts of the country and even within the same state. It's just something to keep in mind. So I try to keep my recommendations applicable to a variety of different forms of government. Hopefully that helps in terms of how they apply to you as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about how governments pay for things in the United States, and then maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions, and then go to the next section. I like this quote, which has been attributed to a lot of different people around through history. But to me as a planner, this is really important. Don't tell me where your priorities are. Show me where you spend your money. And that's what I'll tell you what those priorities are then. So you can make all the plans in the world, but if you're not funding them, they're not really your priorities. And There's been a lot of different people who have said something similar over time. But as a planner, I always take this to heart. You you're only really doing what you're paying for. You can have a recommendation to do something, but if it's not funded, it's not going to happen. And like probably similar to your country, local ways of raising money are limited. Um, this is an example from Massachusetts. It's like I said, it's very different in every part of the country. But just to give one example, in Massachusetts, cities and towns depend on the property tax a lot. So so if you own a piece of property, the city determines how much it's worth and taxes you based on that, a certain percentage of that every year. And it's usually about 1% of the value of the property per year. And obviously it's really important to make sure that properties are valued fairly. So there's a lot of oversight of how these property values are determined. And I think that generally it works fairly well in terms of being fair. It is a challenge if you own a piece of property, but you don't have a lot of money. How do you pay the taxes on it? And that's something you wrestle with, particularly after some sort of disaster, where somebody may own a piece of land that's worth a lot of money, but it's not producing any money anymore. So how can you expect them to pay taxes on it when the building it was on can't be used because of some sort of disaster? And I'm sure that's something that you're experiencing in many of your cities. A lot of other forms of local government revenue in some states, communities can charge sales taxes on sales that happen in their city. So if there's a clothing store and it sells clothes, the local government can charge a sales tax, um, things like that. But then you see the other two big ways of raising money is money coming down from the state and from the federal government. So I mentioned that we have these different levels. States give cities a lot of money in the U.S. It depends a lot on the individual state, but in return, they often want the city or town to do certain things. And that's definitely true with the federal money that gets given from the national government to cities. They'll give cities money, but they'll say you can only use it for certain things. And then finally, charges. This is sort of paying for services. If you want to get a building permit, you pay for it, and that pays for the time to review it. And then also things like parking tickets. If you don't pay a parking meter and you get ticketed for it, that actually raises a fair amount of revenue for local governments. Just to look in Massachusetts, so this is Massachusetts as a state. And just to show that the tax rates vary a lot in different parts of the state. In general, they tend to be lowest in some of the more tourist-oriented, less urban regions. And then they're actually highest in some of the sort of farm areas and some of the areas where there maybe isn't a lot of economic activity. That's often because they have the fewest additional things to raise money with. But they still have to run a police station, a fire station, keep the streets plowed, things like that. And then you look in Boston, and you see somewhere in between. And then I mentioned the state of Massachusetts will give aid to communities, and that varies a lot. Generally, it's designed to help equalize. So the state will give more money to a community where its residents are lower income. So it's designed as a redistributive method. So you'll see in less affluent parts of the state, not so much less affluent actually, but places where there are more poor residents, you'll see more state aid. And this isn't controlled for population. So of course, Boston is much higher because it's a bigger city. But generally, that's the idea in Massachusetts for state aid, is to give it to communities that can't raise as much money locally. Just talking big picture for a second. I'm not going to dwell on this, but the idea that these different cities are actually commodities, and especially more affluent residents have a choice as to where to live. And I want to emphasize this isn't everybody, but people who have the freedom to relocate will often try to find a city that provides the amenities they want. So how do you do that? Yeah, it's a little bit of a game where you figure out what the average resident of your community wants, and you try to provide it. And you may charge a certain level of taxation based on that. So that's called Pareto efficiency. The example is if somebody wants to buy a car and they're willing to pay $15,000 for it, the seller wants to get at least $10,000 for the car. How much will it end up selling for? Probably somewhere in between there. The buyer doesn't know how much the seller wants. The seller doesn't know how much the buyer is willing to pay, but they'll find some place where they're both sort of equally happy or equally unhappy. And in the big picture, that happens with cities and towns as well. When you decide what services to provide as local government or how much you want to invest in your downtown, particularly in a rebuilding situation, oftentimes it's thinking through what the citizens want, at least in a system where the citizens have some choice. There's a lot of books on this, and this also sort of feeds into what's happening in the United States right now, which is political polarization. As people have been more free to move around the country, you've seen people choose different types of cities and towns, which means as individuals, they're getting more of what they want. There is a larger worry here as a planner and as somebody who sort of hopes that there can be, that we can have a cordial society generally, that people are choosing to live based on being near people they want to be near. And there's a book, this is an older book from 2008, but it shows how much that happened even before now when we think about political polarization. But between 1976 and 2004, basically in 1976, where there's all these counties that are shaded white, those are counties that generally were people were fairly moderate. The politics tended to be fairly moderate. And that's based on the presidential election. In 2004, and this is already 20 years ago, you see far fewer of these white counties. And that means the population has chosen to live places with similar people, and the margins are increasing. You have what we often talk about as blue regions and red regions. In this case, it's black and gray. And that's actually been accelerating, obviously, over the last 20 years. And that's something that we think about in the United States when we think about urban planning and how we build or improve cities as well. So you have very liberal communities and very conservative communities. And then just some data this was a New York Times article that just shows this is happening more than ever. It's an interesting article. It just documents just how bad that's become. And again, the freedom to move around the country is a mixed blessing. Again, emphasizing there are a lot of people in this world who don't have the freedom to move. They can't afford to. They own a piece of property and that's where they have to live. They want to be in a place because their family is there or that's where they've been. That's where they're from. And that's, it's easy for economists to say people should just move until they're happy. The planner in me says people like places. So people want to rebuild places. They want to stay in places where they have been. And that makes it more complicated than just saying people should move until they're happy. On the flip side, there actually is some data that says fewer people are moving than ever before, and in the United States at least. And I suspect that's partially because of attachment to place and partially because the gap between housing costs and income is getting wider. And it gets harder and harder to find a place to live, even if you want to. So mobility is going down. So how do cities and towns decide what they want to do? Again, in the general model that I work in the United States, there's a lot of inertia, a lot of bureaucratic force. We've always done it this way. And again, that's not as true when there's a major challenge, such as what you're dealing with, or COVID to a lesser extent, or when there's a big fire or an earthquake. This inertia tends to get shaken, tends to be less. Other ways is people might move if they don't like what they're seeing from your community. Again, I've talked about that. Residents hopefully participate and vote. They'll come and vote in local elections for city council and for mayor. And then states, as I mentioned, can also get involved. They can give money for things they want to see cities do. So they can provide grants for programs, they can give aid to less affluent communities. If there's a fire or a tornado or an earthquake in the United States, they can declare a disaster area, and that means that they're eligible for certain additional money. So that's something that happens when there's a major change. Sometimes people vote directly. There's a lot of indirect ways of voting that are common in city government as well. Oh, and I see a question. Is the road infrastructure sufficient to get to small towns to large ones for work? That's a great question. I would say that generally the road infrastructure is sufficient. What isn't sufficient in the United States is if you don't own a car or you choose not to, you often are in a tough spot. Transit is not very well funded in the United States, and also, other ways of getting from place to place can be challenging. Getting into the actual large city, getting into downtown can often be very difficult. That's where the infrastructure may not be sufficient. But between towns, I would say the United States has actually very good road infrastructure. Part of me worries it's too good because you have to pay to maintain it. And what we're finding now is we built a lot of roads in the 20th century, and now the roads and bridges need to be repaired, and we don't have the money to repair them. So I worry that we actually maybe have overbuilt them a little bit. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to pause now. Actually, are there other questions? I've talked for a while, and I'd be happy to answer questions for a second.
Я був в далекому 2002 році в місті
In
Джексон
2002, I visited Jackson, Mississippi.
на стажуванні. І там
I had
про вимирання центру
there was a story
даунтауну.
about how the downtown, how people were fleeing from it. And so the program about the revitalization program for the downtown, that was the whole program for that. And for me, it was a unique experience while I had my training program there. So the question is, how often such a general revitalization of downtown is generally like the development from the outskirts and to the revitalization of the downtown? How often such programs are implemented in the US?
That's a very good question. It's very common. What happened in the United States in the late 20th century is as we built this excellent roadway infrastructure, we found a lot of people left areas near downtown and started living further out. The suburbanization. And there are a number of reasons for that. One was it was easier to come downtown to work, but you didn't have to live there. Honestly, there were some racial elements to that as well. People were concerned about, this was in the 60s when there was definitely some racial conflict, and a lot of people got scared and said, I don't want to live in the city anymore. It's dangerous. I'm going to live out in the suburbs. So as a result, downtowns really struggled. And then you had the additional impact of a lot of traditional manufacturing closing. And I think that made it worse. A lot of manufacturing initially moved from the north to the south in the United States. Then it moved overseas. And you end up with a lot of empty factories and mills and not much happening. So that there weren't even jobs downtown. A lot of what has happened since the 1980s, in the last 40 years or so, has been related to this downtown revitalization. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that are used for downtown revitalization, but I would say it's a very big topic in urban planning in the United States is how do we make these downtowns more vital? One of the answers, just to give away the answer, is more housing near downtown. It used to be that downtown had a lot of commercial activity and the housing was further out. But we're discovering that people want to live downtown now. And there's these empty mills and factories that can be revitalized by putting housing in them. So as you rebuild the downtown, thinking about putting more housing in than perhaps was there before. And maybe there isn't as much of a separation in Ukraine as there is in the US. But in the US, you often had downtown and you actually weren't even allowed to build housing downtown. Zoning wouldn't even allow you to build housing downtown. Now the trend is to allow more housing downtown as a way of keeping downtowns active. I see a question about bicycles and how many people use bicycles to commute to work. I would say in general, the number is pretty low in the United States, but it varies a lot from place to place. And you might assume that warmer parts of the country have more bicycle commuters, but actually that's not really how it works. It tends to be the older cities that were built more compactly and have, make it so you don't have to bike as far that are more popular. And then within those sort of older cities that are more traditionally built, some cities have planned for bicycles to be able to get downtown more easily by building more bike paths, and building more connections for people. And bikes are more popular in those places. So you'd assume no one, I hear no one bikes in the snow, and that's actually not true. People don't bike where it's not safe to bike. Um, so as you're rebuilding, when we reconstruct streets in the United States, when we decide it's time to rebuild an urban street, we always look at the layout and we say, okay, we used to have 2 travel lanes in each direction for cars and nothing for bicycles and no sidewalk. Maybe we can have 1 travel lane in each direction and a bicycle lane and a sidewalk. And you find that people, as they feel safer, are more willing to bike. In terms of age, it's obviously generally a younger population, but not as much as you would think. I think that to me, the most important thing to get people to bike is to make them feel safe, and to make the infrastructure feel safe. I see a second question about bikes, about bike paths between settlements. There are some in the United States, not as many as I would like, and not as many as you see in other countries, often denser countries. So if you look in Switzerland or in the United Kingdom, you'll see bicycle paths between cities. That does happen in the United States, but it's not nearly as common. And again, something to think about. Uh, where I live in New England, we're starting to see more of that, but it's not common in a lot of parts of the country. Other questions?
Do we have any problems with parking?
Do we have any problems with parking? It's funny. There's a saying in urban planning in the United States that if you don't have a parking problem, you have a parking problem. Because so much of downtown, I mentioned that over time, downtowns had sort of declined, and one of the reasons is if you look at maps of downtown from 1950 and 2000, half of downtown was torn down for parking lots. Because they felt at that time the reason people weren't coming downtown was they could go to the shopping mall and drive there and park. So you needed to compete with that. You needed to provide lots of free parking downtown. And I don't think urban planners were ever that thrilled with that solution. We certainly have seen it be a problem. And we're starting to realize that people aren't not coming down. It wasn't parking that was keeping people from coming downtown. It was a lack of things to do. And it was exacerbated by having too much parking. So we've gotten much more nuanced about how we think about parking in the United States. We think about providing just enough, but not too much. And that might mean that you can't park right in front of the business you want to go to, but you should be able to get a parking place. And also thinking about how much do you charge for that parking. You don't want to charge so much that people won't come, but you want to charge enough that a person just doesn't leave their car there all day, because that's not using the space efficiently. So there's some interesting work by someone named Donald Shoup, Shoup, out of California. And he does a lot of work on how do you price parking so that you have enough parking, but you also have other things that are happening. You don't just sort of pave the entire downtown for parking. So I would say there are parking problems in the city, but it's more complicated than just saying yes, simply.
There is another question. I'm going to translate it. So, do cities have street trading and do they have shopping arcades, something like that?
Yes, so that's an emerging thing that cities are discovering, and I think during the COVID pandemic, they discovered that it was actually really interesting to do that, to provide a place where people can come and open up a shop for the day, but they don't have to buy or rent a space. So you're starting to see more and more of these shopping arcades, really informal in a way. You'll see um, they start with shipping containers. So I've seen places that just find an empty parking lot and put down a bunch of shipping containers and paint them. And then they offer them to vendors by the day or by the week or by the month. And it's a way of incubating new businesses. It's also a great way of sort of providing activity downtown while you wait to do longer term improvements. So it's a quick way to get things happening downtown. It's also a great way to test things out. If you decide you're going to put a temporary arcade somewhere and it doesn't do well, you're really happy you didn't build something really expensive there. There are some places where they built a public market building and it didn't do well. And then they're faced with, what do we do? We spent all this money on this building. If they just put down a bunch of sort of semi-temporary things like shipping containers, if it does well, we'll replace it with an actual, structure. If it doesn't do well, it didn't work. It didn't work out. So we didn't lose that much. So I would definitely encourage that approach, particularly during that phase when you're thinking about trying to get people back downtown, but you don't have time or money to do really expensive things. I think it's a great strategy. Okay, I think I'll go on a little bit and I'll pause again for more questions. My favorite part of this is the questions. So give me 1 second because I think I actually had a problem with my slide show. Give me a second to get back to where I was. Okay, this is close enough.
Oh, we can't see anything.
Yep, nope, there we go. Now can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. So one of the things that we think about, I've mentioned that you have to pay for things in local government, and we just talked about this idea of shopping arcades and maybe how you could do them less expensively. You find that cities and towns in the United States think about how they can locally. Zoning is a very big thing in the United States. It's very common to have communities that don't allow you to do a lot of things on property except maybe build a single family home. And one of the things that we think about is what's called fiscal zoning. How do you balance, how do you create value in your community by allowing the things that pay the most property taxes to happen in those communities? And there's a balance there because you're not just looking to earn money as a city, you're looking to make a great place, and you're looking to make a place that people can live and work and enjoy life. But this is part of it. You don't want to zone your entire city for single family homes that don't pay as much in property tax as maybe apartments or maybe commercial buildings. So there's often some thinking about this. And one case study that I'll show you is near Boston. This is an area in a neighboring community called Somerville in the Boston region. And you can see Boston in the background. And you can see that this was an industrial area that was not doing very well as of when this picture was taken. This was taken in the late 1990s. This is a project I worked on early in my career. And, you look at this site as a planner, as somebody who thinks about revitalization, and you realize this is not the best use for this piece of land. It's very close to downtown, and it's a real opportunity. It's also a challenge for a number of reasons. So let me show you how the city and how the community thought about rebuilding this location and trying to make the most out of it. So first off, here's a picture of this area in the 1950s. This was a huge auto assembly plant. It was designed by Albert Kahn, a famous architect. Lots of great jobs there. They were making Ford Motor Company cars for a long time, doing very well. During World War II, they switched to military uses and they switched back to making cars. And when it was making lots of great jobs for people who live nearby. Then they switched the plant over to a new automobile, a new line called the Etzel. And people in America know the Etzel because it's a famous flop. It was a car that did very poorly, and so they had switched this entire plant over to build Etzels. And when no one bought Etzels, Ford said, "Well, we could turn it back into making other cars, but you know what? We're just going to close it." So they closed the plant, and all those great jobs disappeared. You had this area that was designed for auto manufacturing, and there was no auto manufacturing anymore in this place, at least. Again, a lot of these jobs had moved out of expensive parts of the country, like the Boston area, to other parts of the country, and ultimately overseas. So you move forward about 20 or 30 years. The city had made an attempt to redevelop this Ford plant, which you can see in the middle there, into a shopping mall, into an arcade. And the idea was, let's make this into a shopping center and people will come shop here and there'll be jobs and there'll be commerce and things will go well. What they didn't really think about was that this is actually a pretty inconvenient place to go shop. If you live in the city and you want to go to a shopping mall or you want to go shop, you can go downtown and do that sort of shopping, or you can go out to a suburban shopping mall and it's easy to get to. There's lots of parking, things like that. This was sort of somewhere in between, and it didn't work very well. Is the short answer. It failed as a shopping mall, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned about that. But they tried in the 1980s, and it didn't work as a shopping mall. And they had this idea of sort of how should we convert this area into something active again. So for a long time, they weren't sure what would happen. There was a lot of talk of making it into a place where there'd be large scale retail stores, large chain stores that had a lot of parking and were basically warehouses. In the long run, what happened was it ended up being redeveloped into a mixed use area with housing. Again, I mentioned in some places in the United States, you couldn't have housing. So in this area, in this part of Somerville, you weren't allowed to build housing because the feeling was, we want this to be a shopping area. We don't want there to be housing here. And one of the things we began to realize was housing is a key part of making an area vibrant. So again, I mentioned earlier, I always think housing should be part of a downtown revitalization or an area revitalization. In this case, the idea of allowing housing in this part of the city, especially with housing costs as high as they are in Boston, really unlocked a lot of value. At the same time, they wanted to create jobs. Part of the idea was to create jobs. So they started looking at what role could retail play in this area? What role could the biotech industry that's very strong in Boston play in this area? And at the same time, also, how do we make this place that really only had a couple of streets and felt very industrial feel more like a downtown? So the idea of creating a street grid with multiple streets, you can see the streets on this image. There are more streets and there are blocks that are more like city blocks. And this picture is actually pretty old. I tried to find a newer one. It's much more dense than this now. It's actually amazing how much development has happened in this area. And a big key to that was the subway line goes right by and they built a new subway stop right here. So you didn't have to drive anymore to come to this neighborhood. And again, as you rebuild areas or revitalize areas, thinking about transit and what role can transit play in serving a downtown? For a long time, it was assumed that people would drive everywhere, at least in the United States, and realizing how much land that takes up, and that people don't want to drive everywhere. There are people who don't own cars, who don't want to drive, and opening up this subway stop at Assembly Square made it possible for people to live and visit there much more easily. There was a lot of process here. This is some images from community involvement in how should this area be redeveloped. So we did a lot of work with community groups to think about the best future for this area. The city also did its part. We did a planning study for the area that looked at alternative futures. And we created an urban renewal plan that looked at how could the state help revitalize this area. And we kept coming back to the T station and saying, wouldn't it be great if the subway station was built here? The subway goes right by and doesn't stop. When we add a subway stop here, that really would make a big difference. And the state did end up helping with that. There were a few different development plans that as planners we weren't that excited about. This was one to build a single furniture store that was over 250,000 square feet in size. And all you need to know is that's an enormous furniture store. You don't need to know exactly how big it is. And a new hardware store. The idea that, and then how much parking it would need to serve all of this. This was a scenario that the developers who owned the land were very interested in. The city was not as excited about it, and the neighborhood was the community residents were very unhappy about this. And they had this idea for the area that was very green, that had a street grid that allowed people to visit, that allowed buildings to have a certain scale and feel more comfortable. The T station and more green space along the river, and housing, a few structured parking lots, garages to replace all that surface parking, and then also connections to the rest of the city, which this is an interstate highway. It's very hard to get past it. It's a very large highway, and to sort of improve those connections to the neighborhood nearby. What's interesting about this is not only did it make sense from a planning perspective, but it made sense from a financial perspective. The scenario that the developers were interested in is what's called big box retail here. And you see how few jobs and how little revenue it creates. If you create open space on the whole site, you get lots of open space, but you actually get even less revenue from the site. And this mixed urban model, which had housing, had transit, had jobs, and had a variety of uses, created this balance of some open space, lots of new jobs, and the most net new taxes for the city of Somerville. So really a great idea. If I had time, I would tell you a much longer version of this story, but I don't. But there was a lot of struggle to get to this vision, but I'm happy to say that now we're pretty much at that vision, to the point where the complaint about Assembly Square now is actually that it's too expensive to get a place there, that there's too much going on, that it's too much like downtown Boston, which, these are legitimate concerns. We're very worried about affordable housing and things like that. But comparing it to some of the other futures that could have happened, and the idea that we really did look at redeveloping it in other ways, that had much more parking, was much less human scaled, and had no housing, that I think it generally worked out pretty well. There's a long story about how we had to go through rezoning the property and working with developers to make that happen. Again, it's an interesting longer story, but I think the idea that if you look at a piece of land like that, and I'm sure you're thinking about pieces of land in your cities that are no longer useful, that have been destroyed basically, and as you rebuild them, thinking about that scale and that mix of uses, even downtown, is really important. You often think of downtown as a place where there should be jobs, and there should be, but there should be other things as well. There should be parks, there should be creative outlets, there should be housing. They do best when there's a variety of things there, and when people don't have to drive to get downtown if they don't want to. There's a program in the United States called the Main Streets Program. And I think there's an opportunity perhaps in Ukraine to look at this model, the Main Streets Program. And this is a process that acknowledges that government plays an important role in downtown revitalization, but there's also a role for volunteers and for not-for-profit organizations that are focused on downtown revitalization. And the Main Streets program looks at transforming downtowns through these 4 corners in this diagram. Good design, good promotion, letting people know what's happening downtown, a good organization that focuses on downtown, and economic vitality, making sure that there are good jobs and good local businesses in these areas that put money back into the community. Don't just take the money and export it to another part of the world. So these 4 cornerstones of the Main Streets program are something I'd encourage you to look at and maybe adapt in some format into your local, into the needs that you'll have. But it's a very inspiring program. It's run with very little money. It really relies on a volunteer board that cares deeply about their downtown. And the city ideally can work in partnership with the Main Streets organization to think about downtown revitalization. I just finished teaching a class this semester where we worked with 2 of these Main Streets organizations in Boston. And it was really interesting to think about what they could do well as an independent nonprofit organization versus what the city or the state needed to do, and how it was really a partnership between these different organizations. And it worked best when people were willing to work together, make compromises, and make something good happen downtown. Okay, what I want to talk about now, and then I'll pause for questions again, is a study that I did in 2020, and this was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And everybody was worried about downtowns. Nobody was working downtown anymore. Nobody could pay their rent. And so we started a study in 2020 with a small grant from the university to look at how we could respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and look at sort of rebuilding, which is a little bit of a strong word, but revitalizing and recapturing that downtown that was really struggling during the pandemic. People had discovered working remotely. There was a worry no one would ever come downtown again. Restaurants were closed. Nobody was coming to anything downtown. There was a worry it would be the death of American downtowns. And I think there are still some significant remaining challenges. But this is what this study was really trying to look at. And I think there may be some applicable lessons here to what you're experiencing now. Obviously, what you're experiencing is on a much bigger scale. But still, thinking about how do you revitalize a downtown. So we focused, we had a limited budget and time. So we focused on 6 communities in the Northeastern United States. And we picked these cities that, as I mentioned, are smaller cities, about 100,000 people. So not Boston, not New York, not Detroit, but some of these smaller cities, Portland, Maine, Nashua, New Hampshire, Flint, Michigan, cities you've probably never heard of, but there are a lot of them in the US. And we picked ones that had different economic characteristics. Some were very poor. Flint, Michigan, downtown was almost entirely empty, very low household income. The automobile industry had been very big in Flint and had almost entirely left. So there was very little economic base. And then they had a crisis with their water. There was lead in their water, and they had a problem where people didn't even feel safe drinking the water. So really struggling in a lot of ways. Then there were much more affluent communities in this mix, Nashua, New Hampshire, Haverhill, Massachusetts, ones that had their challenges, but generally were doing better. And we wanted to look at a variety of cities. The one thing we wanted to have in common was that they were all similar in terms of the style of how they'd been built, that they had a downtown that had been built in a pre-automobile era and had multi-story buildings, because you go out to the western part of the US and you see downtowns that you can't even tell you're downtown because everybody drives everywhere and there really isn't much of a downtown. We wanted to look at cities that had downtowns that could be revitalized. And what planning could you do to help with that? So we identified these communities. We found downtown organizations. I mentioned the Main Streets program. There are other programs in the United States that are similar, such as business improvement districts. We wanted a community that had a downtown, somebody working on downtown revitalization. We surveyed the local downtown businesses that mostly were closed at this point or just reopening, to say, what are the challenges you're facing and what could we do to help you rebuild your downtown? And then we analyzed the results. And we did cross sections of each of the communities that I'm not going to go through in detail, but just to provide a baseline and just some photos of downtown to give you a sense of what they look like. We did this for all 6 of the communities. And, you can see they're all relatively similar in that they were pretty much built in the early 20th century. There'd been a lot of stuff torn down for surface parking lots, as I mentioned earlier, but they all were interested in revitalizing their downtowns. So just some information from this study. We looked at what types of businesses had been located downtown before COVID to get a sense of the baseline. And we saw, what mix there was: a lot of restaurants, a lot of retail space, some professional offices. It was good to see some arts and culture as well. And then this category of other. So what was nice about this was to realize how diverse the businesses downtown are. That's not something you see outside of downtown as much. You tend to see an area that's an industrial area or a retail area or a housing area. These downtowns has confirmed our thought that downtowns really have a nice mix, which makes them really resilient in the long run, even when something bad happens. Also, mostly small businesses. And again, this is an opportunity and a challenge. But to us as planners, it's mostly an opportunity. It means that the decisions are being made locally and that local people tend to be employed in these businesses and the money tends to stay in the community. So a few very large employers, but almost half of the businesses had 5 or fewer employees. And I think you probably will find that's true in most downtowns. High percentage of women-owned businesses. This was more than we thought. Half of the businesses were owned by women. So that was good to see. And it was interesting to see that downtowns in particular, that was true for. We then asked, what did they need? And, obviously the first thing that people identified in the short term was, I need money. I need grants. I need loans. I need a way to keep my business open, to build my inventory and to get through this time period where I'm not going to be making as much money so I can stay open. Second, I need relief from my rent or from my mortgage. I'd love to pay the landlord my rent, but I don't have any revenue. So how do I pay my rent? Some wishing the city would just go back to normal, for want of a better term. And of course, we all wish that sometimes, but probably not something we can wave a magic wand and do right away. And then some insistence on marketing, things like that. And these were short-term needs. This is what the businesses identified they wanted in 2020 immediately. We then said, okay, so thinking ahead, now that you've gotten that off your chest, because we knew you wanted a chance to complain about how bad things are right now, what would you like to see in the long run, over 3 to 5 years? And we got a sort of different set of answers for that, which I thought was very interesting. Certainly interest in financial incentives, but a lot of interest in rebuilding differently, providing not as much street parking, providing more open space and more places where people could dine outdoors. Interest in being more flexible with some of the zoning and health codes. I don't know about in your country, but in the United States, it's very difficult to open a restaurant, and that's understandable. You want people to be safe in a restaurant, but oftentimes the businesses were concerned that you're picking on very little details and keeping me from opening, when really you should focus on the big picture. So again, whether legitimate or not, feeling like some of these local codes were too stringent. And then, not as much interest in people living downtown, but I would attribute that a little bit to people not really thinking about how that could help them as businesses. But certainly interest in looking at other ways that zoning and health code affect them. And just some examples of what people identified. This was back during COVID, so asking, some states didn't require mask usage, saying we should require people to use masks so that people feel safe going into restaurants. Things, just a lot of different questions. This isn't so much relevant anymore because this was really during the heat of COVID. So it was really focused on that. So our long-term recommendations, reimagining these downtown uses and investing in downtown housing, as I've mentioned a couple of times. Looking at if you're going to help local businesses, oftentimes the temptation is to provide technical assistance to businesses. So if you want to reopen something downtown, I can give you technical assistance. That's because it's cheaper to give technical assistance, but really small businesses wanted grant programs from the state and federal government or from their local government. They said, I know what to do. I need help doing it. I need money to do it. Looking at how much businesses are charged for rent and making sure that they can actually stay open, they can pay the rent. And then again, a lot of interest in these common spaces, these areas where traditionally in the United States, you'd have a road, you'd have surface parking, you might have a very small sidewalk. Thinking about redistributing that to make these places more attractive for people to come visit and stay. Outdoor dining, little park spaces, bike lanes, better sidewalks, moving the parking into structures or moving it further away or pricing it so that there's more turnover. But thinking about these public spaces and as planners, that's something we actually can control. So that was interesting to hear. And one of the examples is oftentimes in downtowns, and I'm sure this is true in some of your cities, you have an area that maybe is doing well, but then you have a gap. And then you might have another area that's doing well. So I did some work with a student to think about how to connect those places. And the idea that he came up with is what I call the, ooh, what's that? If there's a gap in your downtown, how do you draw people past it? And it can be done through signs or lighting or a mural or a piece of public art, even just sort of more businesses this way. But how do you connect those different pieces? Because when you're rebuilding a downtown, there's going to be gaps. Some buildings will be rebuilt sooner than others. And how do you get people to go from the one part that's been rebuilt to another part when there's empty lots in between, for example? So this idea of, oh, I see something interesting down there. How can I want to go see what that is. And it can be something simple like a lighting project or a piece of public art, but something to get them past that empty part of downtown. So I think with that, I'll pause again and see if there's other questions. And happy to answer other people's questions or interested in hearing your thoughts. You have good cases or experience to transform streets only for pedestrians? Oh, that's a great question. And there's a lot of discussion about this idea of downtown pedestrian malls, we call them. This was very popular in the 1970s in the United States. I think hundreds of cities looked at closing their downtowns to cars and providing them just for pedestrians. Sometimes they'd allow buses to go through. And it was a really mixed experience. Some of them did really well and are still open. Burlington, Vermont has a downtown marketplace called Church Street, and it's renowned nationwide as a great place to come and visit and go to the stores. Other places did this and found all the businesses did poorly, and they ended up reopening the street to traffic. So, there was a mixed bag. And then during COVID, a lot of communities tried this again and had a pretty good experience, I think mostly because people felt much safer going downtown and eating outside or walking around outside versus going into stores. And what you're seeing now is a little bit of a middle ground where I know New York City has famously closed a lot of these parklet areas because they want to go back to providing parking on their streets. Other cities have decided to keep some of them open. And I would generally encourage people to think about where they're successful. It's sort of a fun way to experiment. If you try closing all your streets downtown and see which ones work and which ones don't, you can sort of be strategic if you do it thoughtfully. It can be tricky just doing it on weekends. You ask about doing it part of the time. If you do that, and there are places that do that, you have to make sure the signage is really good and that people know that's happening and have to remember to come back. So for example, if you do only close a street on a weekend, you probably want to have something special happening that weekend, like a farmer's market or something that will draw people to that street. Because if you just close it, it's nothing. There's no real reason to go there just for the weekend without knowing why. And if you're interested, if you look on and I can post in the chat my personal webpage at MIT, this study that I mentioned that I did with this graduate student, he was great at coming up with ideas for what to do when you close streets, either temporarily or permanently. So I'll make sure to put that link in the chat before we get off. But a great question. And I'd say it can work really well. You do have to be thoughtful about how you do it. Maybe I'll put that in the chat while I'm waiting to see if there's other questions. Let's see. How do cities prioritize which initiatives develop on first floors when budgets are limited? That is a very good question. It's hard to answer too well without knowing generally what budgets you have to work with. But as I said, I'm a big fan of sort of pop-up things. If you put a call out to local businesses and say, we're going to have a sort of a merchant's fair on this corner lot on Saturdays, and we'd love for you to come do it. That's something that can be done very inexpensively. You really just need some security. You maybe need to put in some infrastructure so that people feel safe there, maybe a couple of porta potties. And, you know, you don't need to build anything permanent to try to see if people will come downtown. In fact, it can be sort of fun if in this era of social media, if you get a buzz going about, there's going to be a little merchant event here this weekend. And if it does well, keep doing it. And maybe you eventually build something more permanent. But I'm a big fan of trying these things. I've seen this also happen in first floors of buildings that are empty. So communities where you have downtown streets where there are some empty storefronts. I've seen the city talk to the property owner and basically use that space at a very low price just to have some activity, like a little sort of indoors pop-up market, which of course is nicer in the winter. And again, there's some cost to that. You have to make sure that you have electricity and heat, and you know, you're going to want bathrooms. But oftentimes a landlord might say, great, I'm glad to see something happening in my building. By the way, maybe this is for rent if anyone wants it. It's almost like free marketing for them. So doing these sort of like little temporary light things, and government's bad at that. I worked in government for 25 years. Government is not good at thinking about these quick, fast, and in a hurry things. That's why I like organizations like these Main Streets organizations, that this is what they do. And if government works with them, they just asking you to, for example, provide porta potties. So I've worked with Main Streets organizations that say, we'll run the farmers market. Will the city bring porta potties to the site on Saturdays and take them away on Sunday? And government can say yes to that more easily than suddenly I need to run a farmer's market. So I love these sorts of quick, sort of fast and in a hurry things like that. Here, and I will post this link to these publications while I'm thinking of it. How does any priority for local producers, and how do you support or stimulate them? That's a really good question. Local food has become a big issue in New England in particular, where MIT is. Traditionally, a lot of the food in the United States is grown out in the Midwest, where the land is flat. It's very easy to run a large agribusiness and then processed and brought to places like New England. New England's well known for having, you know, rocky soil, small farms that struggle. And there's been a real movement in the last 15 or 20 years towards local foods. So New England in particular has discovered that in Maine, in northern New England, there's actually a lot of great farmland, and there's a lot of people who want to work on farms up there. And so looking at local foods also as an economic development activity. So there's stores, there's businesses that their whole business model is local food. There's a store called Clover in Boston. It's a small chain, and their thing is all of their food is sourced locally, and they actually have a map inside their store that shows where all their food comes from in New England. So we have grains from Maine, we have, you know, cranberries from Cape Cod, and people like that. People like eating locally, and they really enjoy it. The question of how do you support that? You know, you have to make it so that you understand what the economic limitations are to growing food locally. You know, are there regulatory barriers? Are there infrastructure barriers? How can you make it so that there's an infrastructure to bring this food into into the markets. And that can be hard. Sometimes it just comes down to protecting that land, saying this land is going to be turned into single family homes or redeveloped, but in the long run, we want to keep it as a farm. So how can we provide the right incentives to keep that as a farm? And sometimes it's through tax policy. Sometimes you say, we're going to allow you to put an agricultural restriction on your land. And as a result, you won't have to pay the property taxes you normally would. You can pay a lower property tax that will allow you to afford to keep it as a farm, even if the quote unquote highest and best use is as single family homes. How developed is the waste recycling industry? Where are such recycling facilities located and who owns them? So that varies a lot from parts of the country. New England tends to be more interested in recycling and tends to support it more. A lot of the reason why is that we are running out of landfill space in New England. It's a much more densely developed part of the country. Out in the Midwest, there's tons of space to build new landfills. So waste recycling is much more popular in some parts of the country than others. The recycling facilities tend to be regional. So you tend to have a recycling facility that's actually run by a bunch of communities, maybe 10 or 15 cities in a region. And so they can get an economy of scale that way. And they can also get enough inventory that they become better at negotiating with the reusers of recycling. So I definitely encourage these facilities at a regional basis with communities working together on them. They tend to be owned by some sort of quasi-public agency because the market isn't really there for private recycling yet. And one of the challenges is we found that the price of recycled goods varies widely. So paper, for example, recycling paper, sometimes it's worth a lot, sometimes it's losing money. So how do you think through that long-term, fluctuation in value? And it may involve creating sort of a counter-cyclical. We're going to subsidize recycling when we're not getting a lot of money for it. And we're going to, get the profits when it does make money and put them away for a rainy day. But unfortunately, a lot of parts of the United States just say, you know what, we have a lot of land. We're just going to build more landfills. That's not something we have the space to do in New England. Interesting comment from Ole about, I observed an interesting experience in German cities. Every 3 years, the city authorities conduct marketing research. Oh, that is interesting. So you do see some communities doing that sort of market research. And I love it. I think the risk, there's two risks to doing it. One is you're being too wishful and hopeful that you end up deciding that a community should have the things that you think it should have without any market reality. And obviously doing a real market research study should dispel that. The flip side is you're too cynical and you're too profit driven. These are the most profitable businesses downtown. So for example, in a tourist city, you might say there needs to be more souvenir shops. When there are other profitable uses that actually provide non-financial benefits to your community. So I think it's a really interesting idea. I do think you need to be careful about finding that balance between what the community really needs, but also is feasible. We have a lot of communities that require that when you build something downtown, you build commercial space on the ground floor. The idea being we should have more commercial space. It should be on the ground floor. We don't want housing on the first floor. But then a lot of it sits empty. And I think it's because they've overbuilt their downtown. So I often work with communities and say, you shouldn't require commercial space downtown if the market isn't there. You should require an active front, it should look active, it should look vital, it shouldn't look like someone's house, but it doesn't necessarily have to be commercial because you can force them to build the commercial, but you can't force them to find a tenant for it. So the market has to really be there. See, what is your opinion on placing monuments, memorials on central streets, or should separate places be allocated for them? I generally think they should be on central streets. I think, again, everything you can do to attract people to downtown is important. And when they're in separate places, unless it's something, I mean, I can see doing it in some circumstances where where it's really important to have a separate space because it's going to be very popular, or because you want a quiet place for contemplation based on something happened that's sad, basically. But in general, I think that monuments should be on the central streets. In Portland, Maine, where I live, we have what's called Our Lady of the Sailors, and it's one of the biggest bronze statues in the country, and it's right in the middle of downtown on Monument Square. And it's a great gathering place for people. It's meet by the old Our Lady. People will meet by the statue, and it's also a monument to Civil War veterans that died in the U.S. Civil War. So I generally like them. I generally like them where they're highly visible and where people will come across them accidentally, for want of a better term. All right. Let me do my last little piece here, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. We are getting a little short on time, but I think I can talk about Iceland fairly quickly. So I had a chance to go to Iceland last summer, and why Iceland, you might ask? I'm very interested in colder cities and how they handle the cold in terms of being livable. Also, climate change. And then also, Iceland was an interesting example because in the United States, we're often, as planners, looking at Europe and saying, oh, we should do things the way they do it in Amsterdam or the way they do it in Brussels. Iceland's a little more like a North American country, honestly. So I thought it was an interesting, different example. So I went to 3 Icelandic cities. Just looking generally at Iceland, it's a very young country, very car-oriented, much more like North America than like Europe in a lot of ways. And they also are thinking about things like climate change and tourism and how they're being overwhelmed with tourists. So how do they adapt to that and make sure that people who are from Iceland can continue to be there? I looked at these 3 cities, the capital, Reykjavik, and it's a capital, but it actually is very small. It's about 100,000 people. Kópavogur, which is one of those cities right near Reykjavik that's growing very quickly, has a challenge of growing in maybe not the most sustainable way, very auto-oriented. And then I went up to Akureyri, which is up north, and I thought it was an interesting place because it's really the only standalone city in Iceland that's away from the capital region. They're growing very quickly. These numbers for Americans are sort of eye-popping how quickly these cities are growing. In 14 years, Reykjavik grew by 16%. So Iceland is dealing with growth in a way that a lot of places, at least in the United States, are not. Just some interesting urban infrastructure in Reykjavik that I thought was stuff to think about as you build or rebuild cities. Separated bike paths, places where people could collect their farm shares. Somebody had asked about local farming. This is a little sort of hut in a downtown square where local farms that offer vegetables in a group, you can get a package called a farm share, and they leave them there, and then you have a fob and you can go in and pick up your farm share from it. Again, it's a nice way of getting people downtown and providing a source of regular revenue for local farms. And just some of the interesting details in architecture and pedestrian streets. Someone had asked about pedestrian streets. Just doing a nice job, again, retrofitting a city that was built very much in the United States model, not in the European model originally. They also are doing some interesting redevelopment of areas that previously had not been developed. They are growing very quickly. They want to grow sustainably. So I looked at this area that's in the circle here. And right now, this is what it looks like. It's former farmland, volcanic, not very high production farmland, but very near downtown. And so my first concern when I see this is, oh no, you're going to build a bunch of single family homes here and it's not going to really do much for the city and you're going to lose this open space. But actually, they have a very different strategy for this. They came up with a model of very dense neighborhood of multifamily buildings, 4 to 5 story buildings, focused on a bus rapid transit route, a bus route that would go right through the center of this area and would make it very easy to get downtown without driving. In fact, they would have parking garages at the edges of these areas so that people have to get a little away from their car, and it's actually more convenient to take transit. So building it out in this sort of dense area where I think they said they could fit 10 or 20,000 people in this land. The planner in me starts to get excited. Excuse me. And I'll show you the bus rapid transit route in a minute. Another place that I thought was interesting was what they call their ocean cluster. They have a lot of fishing. So, every country has its own thing that it produces a lot of. They produce a lot of fish in Iceland. So this ocean cluster area it's a redevelopment district, but one of the things that's very exciting about it is that they look at using the whole fish. So they think about all the waste products from the fish and how can they use them economically. So you can apply that locally to whatever your local product is. They were throwing away most of the fish, but can we reuse the scales? Can we reuse the bones? Can we use it more efficiently than we were before? In Maine, they're looking at lobsters. How can we use the lobster shells for things? Whereas right now we're throwing them away. This community, Kopavogor, it's a relatively suburban community, but they're looking at redeveloping along the waterfront. And also preserving their working waterfront at the same time. And how are they able to do that? They're creating this new bus transit line that's limited access, sort of like a train line, but buses. So they would have you see the thick red line here, that would go through both the redevelopment district in Reykjavik and also into Kopavogor. And this would be a limited stop bus that felt a little bit like a train, but had the flexibility and a lower price point. So it could be implemented more quickly and less expensively than a subway line. And it would be the first sort of rapid transit line in the entire country of Iceland. So it's interesting to see them thinking bold. And as part of that, they want to build this new bridge over the harbor. That would be for buses and bikes only. And it would make it so much faster to get across the harbor than you can in the car. The idea is to give the bus and bikers and walkers a competitive advantage. Finally, I flew over the center of Iceland, which was kind of a crazy experience. I went up to northern Iceland, and this city, Akureyri, was very interesting. It's built on the side of a fjord. The things that I learned as a planner there that was interesting is they are encouraging people to use transit by providing free buses. I'm not always a fan of providing transit for free for a lot of reasons, but in this case, I thought it was a good way of encouraging people not to drive because it's actually very easy to drive in Akureyri. They have a great urban trail system. Someone asked about biking and walking around to work. In Akureyri, it's very easy to get from place to place on trails, in addition to driving. And then they think a lot about third places. So this is just their church and some information about their growth over time. Some examples of places that have been built in the last 10 or 12 years. But what I wanted to get to was this slide of sort of third places where people gather. So the three prototypes, this is in the middle of a botanical garden. They built a little restaurant in the middle of the botanical garden. That's an amazing building, but also just a great attraction. I saw people waiting when it was opening at 10 a.m. to go, which I don't usually see in botanical gardens. In Iceland, the swimming pools are big. They have hot springs that feed naturally heated swimming pools. This is sort of a gathering place. It was fun to see when school got out, all the school kids went over to the pool, and it wasn't that warm out. But these are heated pools at like 30, 40 degrees centigrade. So not a bad place to go in the winter. And then just a nice downtown sort of opera hall, music hall, place where there's theater and where there's things like that. So just thinking through those places. And then thinking through climate change and the fact that climate change isn't as simple as you might think. Iceland's actually worried that climate change may make it cooler there because it may affect the Gulf Stream. And that's actually a very ominous thing for Iceland. It's not a warm country now. If it gets colder, that might be a challenge. Lessons, finally, and then I'll stop sharing and see if we have time for a couple more questions. To plan boldly, to think about reinventing these places as you rebuild them, thinking regionally and entering into multi-municipal compacts for things like recycling. If there's tourist interest, leveraging it, but not just giving in to tourists. Thinking about urban path systems and talking about things other than just driving. And then building these sorts of third places that people might want to come to naturally. And the question about monuments downtown, a monument can also be a third place where people gather. So with that, just some sunny pictures of Northern Iceland. And thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. Let me see if there's any last questions, though. We're almost out of time, but maybe there's time for one question if anyone has it.
Колеги, чи є у вас питання?
Any questions?
З вашого дозволу, я одне запитання пробую
Okay,
задати.
I still want to ask one question.
Я хочу попросити, яке ваше бачення? Уявіть
I would
собі, що
like to
через
ask
10 років ми
about
знову
your
говоримо
vision.
про
Let's
міста, які тенденції
imagine that
врахувати,
we're gonna
щоб
talk
бути
about cities like
конкурентними
in 10 years. So what
часто будемо будувати міста
conditions we
взагалі
have to take into
світу
account to
на
be
наших
competitive in the
локаціях.
world? Because
Хотілося б
we are
вам
going
зробити,
to
щоб
rebuild our
згадати,
cities even from scratch.
перспективу десь
But
на
how to guess this 10 years perspective, like these tendencies?
Yes, I think no one has a crystal ball. So the first thing I would encourage is to try a lot of different things and to try things by piloting projects. So I mentioned earlier, don't build a market hall or an arcade. Start with containers and see if they do well. So build incrementally. But the other thing that I would encourage you, if you're thinking 10 years out in terms of rebuilding, is to think of some signature things downtown, things that will attract people, and not to sort of put a blinder on the previous downtown that was there before, but building on it. So, I think of things like the memorial they have at the World Trade Center in New York, which attracts lots of people to that part of the city. After September 11th, they thought that area was dead, that nothing was ever going to happen there again. And by building this monument, they've attracted people downtown again. So thinking of signature things for areas, but also thinking about what you didn't like about the old downtown. So we don't have to put on rose-colored glasses and say everything was great 20 years ago. I know in American cities, we all wish we hadn't torn down as many buildings for parking. So as we rebuild, we think about providing more buildings, more activity, putting the parking on the edge of downtown. So thinking honestly about what you didn't like about your city before, what you'd like to recreate, and what maybe you'd like to replace with something new. And part of that is going to involve some experimentation. Some of it's going to not work. That's okay. It's okay to experiment and fail, as long as you're thoughtful about it and you don't, throw a lot of money into the fire.
Дякую. Колеги, чи будуть ще у вас
Thank you
питання?
very much, dear colleagues. Do you have any more questions?
Ми вклалися в час.
So we are right on time, and we really received a great deal of different perspective, of different information, which is a good food for thought. We need to digest all of it because we understand that we have, yes, to reconstruct the existing means and even to reconstruct cities from scratch. So it's a great challenge of ours. Mariupol, for example, I'm going to show you something. This is the book. That is the big, I'm sorry, it's blurred a bit. It's a big, it's the urbanists project when in planning of how they see the rebuilt city of Mariupol, of the destroyed city. So there are lots of moments which are connected with the competitiveness of the cities, which will depend on how much ideals will become the input for the future reconstruction. So of course, we really appreciate your external expertise. So if we have any possibility to reach out to the American community of urbanists as with regard to their vision, their perspective, and their support, that's the greatest request from ours, which is right now. Because it is important for us to build the country as a challenge. No, we need to rebuild strong country because we will still live with these neighbors, with our enemies. But we want to say thank you for your time, for your insights, for your expertise. And you know what I love about these lectures is that we really are reaching out to the whole sequence of foreign expertise, which is eye-opener for our opportunities. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you for this opportunity to communicate with you, to listen to you, and to grasp the knowledge from you.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor, and I've really enjoyed it. And I will put my email in the chat, and please feel free to reach out. You have our support, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.